Cillian Murphy's 28 years later return was perfectly set up by this story 15 years ago. When 28 years later was announced, fans rejoiced at the return of Cillian Murphy's Jim, a character who helped redefine modern zombie cinema with his raw vulnerability and desperate resolve. Yet, while his reappearance might feel like a long-awaited surprise, it was actually perfectly foreshadowed 15 years ago. A lesser-remembered entry in the 28 Days Later franchise, the graphic novel 28 Days Later, The Aftermath, quietly laid the groundwork for Murphy's re-emergence in the most chilling and poetic way imaginable. Released in 2007, The Aftermath bridged the gap between 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. While its spotlight shone on a different set of characters, its final segment, titled Decimation, contained subtle clues about the long-term consequences of the rage virus, both in terms of its global impact and the moral trauma inflicted on its survivors. Among the whispers of corruption, scientific experimentation, and survivor guilt was the thematic seed for Jim's return. Though Jim doesn't physically appear in The Aftermath, his presence is felt in the graphic novel's DNA. The story's tone mirrors the haunting quiet of the original film's third act, when Jim, Selena, and Hannah hole up in an abandoned cottage, trying to carve out a normal life after hell. Decimation suggests that no one truly escapes the shadow of the rage virus. Even those who survive it aren't immune to its psychological aftershocks. It implies that the real horror isn't just the infected, it's what people become in the wake of catastrophe. That's precisely what makes Jim's return in 28 years later so powerful. He was never just a survivor, he was a symbol of the quiet resistance against the madness. The man who chose humanity over vengeance in the original movie's final scenes is exactly the kind of figure the world would seek out decades later. But The Aftermath also hinted that such a person wouldn't emerge unscarred. Set 15 years ago, The Aftermath showed scientists trying to control or even weaponize the rage virus. It wasn't just about containment, it was about exploitation. That storyline strongly echoes 28 years later's apparent themes, where survivors like Jim may be pulled back into a crisis they once narrowly escaped. Jim's return might not be as a fighter or a leader, but as a living relic, someone whose first-hand experience with rage makes him both dangerous and essential. Moreover, The Aftermath wrestled with the moral ambiguity of survival. One of its characters, a virologist named Clive, tried to engineer a cure, only to realize that the institutions funding his work were more interested in the virus's weapon potential. This mirrors Jim's likely role in 28 years later. His intimate knowledge of how society crumbled and who benefited from it could position him as a moral compass or possibly a scapegoat. The world might have moved on, but Jim never truly could. Murphy's Jim has always been more than a lone survivor. He represents a kind of reluctant everyman, caught in the gears of a disaster too large to comprehend. When he awoke in an abandoned hospital in 28 Days Later, it was a metaphor for modern man's alienation in the face of global catastrophe. The Aftermath expanded on that theme by showing how institutions respond to horror, not with compassion, but with cold calculation. That's where the perfect setup lies. By the end of The Aftermath, readers were left with a sense that this story wasn't over. That the virus wasn't truly gone. That some survivors, possibly even Jim, were out there trying to live ordinary lives in a world incapable of offering peace. It planted the idea that the rage virus wasn't just biological, it was ideological. It spread through fear, through control, through decisions made in boardrooms as much as in labs. Now, 28 years later, Jim's story returns, likely against his will, and certainly against better judgment. But the brilliance is, that return was written in the margins 15 years ago. The Aftermath warned us that survivors don't stay survivors forever. Eventually, they become witnesses. Or warriors. Or martyrs. Murphy's return isn't just fan service. It's the completion of a story arc that began not just on screen, but in panels and pages most fans overlooked. And now, as the world of 28 years later rises once more into chaos, Jim steps back into the fire, not as the man who ran, but as the man who must finally face what running left behind.